basic objective of our trip was to go through the prison camps in South Vietnam to determine how the prisoners held by the South were being treated. This is a commitment we made to the North Vietnamese at Christmas. We kept the commitment. We went through all the camps. We visited nearly 8,000 North Vietnamese military personnel, 23,000 Viet Cong prisoners. Without any question, I predict that we'll see an increased flow of names, letters, and relief for the men as a result of this experience. Already we've seen, since we met in Vien Thanh one day, the next day 81 names were released through peace groups, 400 new letters were released. So we're already beginning to see the reaction from the pressure, and it would be unrealistic to call it anything other than pressure. Let me say this, we'll intensify our efforts. We'll go more and more to events over which the North Vietnamese have no control, events that put them under a great deal of pressure. But I'd like to say to every family of a prisoner that we're in this until the men are back home, and all we're going to do from this point forward is just further intensify our efforts and the pressure. Any other questions?
Since you didn't get into Vietnam, or into North Vietnam, do you feel this trip was a failure?
No, I don't feel it's a failure for all the reasons I've just given. We've gotten the North Vietnamese have created a severe problem for themselves. Much of the success of the trip was created by the North Vietnamese because they made a series of very serious mistakes. If they had been shrewd, they would have accepted the list, accepted the films, accepted the mail, and if they didn't want to tell their people, they could have thrown it away right after we left. But in refusing to do this, and refusing to do it so publicly in Laos and again in Paris, 3 times in Paris, they've dramatized to the world in a way that nobody else could, that they don't care about their men.
On September 9th of last year, 7-year-old Donna Marie Golish was abducted after leaving school here in Sherman. 2 days later, her almost nude body was found northeast of town here in a field. Almost 7 months later, to the day on April the 1st, 11-year-old Frances Laurie Stevens of Denison disappeared after leaving her school in Denison. A few days later, her nearly nude body was found in a field northwest of Denison. 18-year-old Charles Dennis Easley was arrested this last Wednesday in connection with the case. Today he was formally charged with the murder of those 2 girls. I talked with Grayson County Sheriff Woody Blanton about the case. What led you to believe that he was the man that you were looking for in both of these cases?
Well, our investigation revealed that there were a lot of similarities in a lot of respects concerning both murders, and during the investigation we was able to obtain evidence that tied both of them together.
What evidence led you to believe that he is the man that you were really looking for?
Well, of course, you have a statement there, and we've covered what we could in the statement, and we're not at liberty to make any statements concerning the evidence that we have.
Has he signed a confession or a statement at this time?
That I'd have to say that we can't elaborate on that either at this time.
Easley is currently being held here in the Grayson County Jail without bond, pending grand jury action on those 2 cases. This is Carl Mayo in Sherman, Channel 8 News.
Well, I pulled into the Pauley Bank, and I got out with my box of diamonds, and Page got out with a box of rare coins, and Miss Matthews got out on the other side, and I started ahead of them, and I saw this Negro man standing between 2 cars, and I kind of went as far as I could away from him, and just as I got there, he stepped up on the curb, and he said, "Hi there." And then he grabbed a hold of my arm and said, "Give me that box." And I didn't do it. He said, "Give me that box." And I didn't do it, so then he held my arm and come out from under his coat with a pistol, stuck it right in my stomach. And as he did, I hit his hand with my left hand and knocked the gun up, and he fired right over my head, and I come out from under my coat with my pistol, and I didn't want to shoot him in the stomach, and I tried to shoot him in the hip or leg, so I shot down a little, and I shot, and I backed up, and I shot again. I hit him twice, I think. Then he fired at me a few times. I don't know how many, but I backed on up again, and then he kept shooting, and I shot again, hit him the third time. I didn't know at the time how many times I shot him, but I did hit him 3 times, and he fell and dropped his gun. Well, I aimed the gun at him again so he wouldn't try to pick it up. I was going to shoot him in the hand if he did. And then I backed on away and stood there for a little bit, and I saw that he couldn't get to the gun. Then I opened the bank door and I hollered inside and had somebody call the police. I just shot a Negro robber out here.
The principal federal effort this year is in the Controlled Dangerous Substances Act. This amounts to a codification of existing federal narcotic laws, bringing them together into one place. This is something that's needed to be done. A reclassification of dangerous substances and putting them in some logical sense. And finally, a relook at the penalties for the abuse or misuse of these dangerous substances, putting those penalties in a more logical order. There's been great public debate on this question of penalties, but that debate will be resolved this year, I'm quite sure, by federal legislation which has passed the Senate and is now pending in the House.
In the future, do you think we will have to import labor from some other country here to fill the average needs of the United States labor market?
Now, I would say that at this point we do not feel that we're going to have to import professional people in any way. I understand that they are training in England and some of the other areas, nurses and chauffeurs, and I'm not putting those in all of them in the same category, but these are some of the areas that they are now considering in some of the foreign countries and bringing into this country.
Do any of the agencies that you have knowledge of bring in these girls, say from Ireland, such as we have here in one of our hospitals?
Am I familiar with
Yes.
them? No, really I'm not. I know that this is a coming thing and that we'll be hearing more and more about it, but at this time I'm really not familiar enough to even
This means
discuss
then
it.
that your organization is going to have to look to overseas then perhaps for certain job categories.
I think that at some future date we probably will, with things changing like they are.
Your clothes are probably deteriorating a little more rapidly than normal. Certainly the house gets dirty faster. People are being harmed. Plants, animals, almost anything you can think of.
Is there a way that we can get people aware of the problem, of the need to control air pollution?
I believe that public education is going to be the key, and training qualified personnel to cope with the problem as the jobs are created.
Our suppliers have been very kind to donate the top of their line, so to speak, in merchandise, materials, first one thing and then the other, that we know that the house will be of value much higher than $35,000.
In the Taka auction, what do you expect to get for this house? You have any kind of expectation?
The best bid that we can. We don't anticipate that the house will auction off for more than it's worth, and we think that, on the contrary, that it should be a very good buy for someone who would bid in the house. and had been quite successful at it.
Mr. Perot, with this nearly 2-week trip over, what are your feelings about this attempt to get information into North Vietnam and out of North Vietnam?
Well, it's something I had to do because I told the North Vietnamese I'd do it at Christmas, that I would show the same concern for their men that I had for our men. We've done that now. We've toured the camps in the South. We attempted to bring information to the North Vietnamese, and for reasons I guess best known to themselves, they refused to accept the information. I'm disappointed for the families in the North because I know they would like to know whether or not these men are dead or alive, what their status is. So from that point of view, it's a disappointment. On the other hand, the North Vietnamese made a number of serious mistakes during this trip, in my opinion, and that they very tangibly demonstrated to the whole world that they have no concern for their own men. That puts North Vietnam in a very awkward position, I think, with world opinion, and true to pattern, I think they'll start to scramble to recover from a serious setback they imposed on themselves. As they scramble to recover, we'll see more names, more letters, etc., etc.
Having traveled with you this past 2 weeks, I understand that you do consider the trip successful to a large degree, although you didn't accomplish all of the things you set out. What about things in the future along this line? What now is open to you?
Well, we've already started pursuing other objectives. We'll intensify our efforts, and I think that when the North Vietnamese look back on this, they will, in all candor, have to say to themselves that it would have been far wiser to treat the prisoners properly from the very beginning, because they have created, by their bad treatment, a huge issue. By turning their backs on their own men, they've created an even larger issue.
Abby, how successful would you be if we didn't give you the coverage that we give you? Such as like we're giving you coverage right here. How successful would you have been, man, if the press just lay off you, you know?
Well,
if our brothers and sisters wouldn't, you know, if they didn't get the word of your campaign, what you're trying to do.
Well, our uncle's Walter Cronkite. I mean, we have like a standing long-term family commitment with him, and Merv Griffin.
Yeah.
The general consensus of not wanting to spend more money is due to a lack of knowledge as to the value to our entire economy and the value to our scientific advancement, our educational advancement that the space program has brought to us. I think we've been derelict in not doing a better job of acquainting the people as to the real profit that has accrued from this operation.
Do you think part of it is because the public has become just kind of bored with the newness, that they've worn into the idea of the space flight?
Well, I think that they were built up to a pitch, to a climax, to where they thought that everything was around landing a man on the moon. So they say, well, now that's done, so what? Without thinking that our knowledge and the profit, and there has been a profit in it, came from the development of our ability and our technique to perform these moon landings. It wasn't just to put a man on the moon.
Dallas voters will get another trip to the polls on April 25th to elect a school board trustee for position number 2. This action came today in a special meeting held here at the school administration building. It all began a week ago when Dallasites began casting ballots for 4 school board seats. The election at the outset was considered by some to be one of the most controversial school board elections in the history of the Dallas School District. It was also scheduled to require extra time to tally the votes due to the use of paper ballots. The late counting apparently carried over into Sunday morning. At least that is when the final counts reached the administration building. The tardiness caused incumbent CGS candidate John Plath Green, after discovering a couple of errors in the late boxes, to contest the election. This action will be taken by CGS candidates in a lawsuit. Green told me that the odds are better in a courtroom than they would be to request a recount. He says that if he loses in the runoff election to Mrs. Henderson, he may still win if the courts rule in his favor. Also, the other CGS candidates have a chance to be seated if fraud can be established. The board also voted to submit a proposal to seek funds for Girls Adventure Trails Incorporated, a program for girls with emotional problems. Coach East Cash, Channel 8 News.
We were concerned about the drug problem because there was an awful lot of articles in the paper and in the magazines about 3 weeks ago. So we thought, what can we do? And Craig had recently been out in California and heard Dr. Hardin Jones from the University of California at Berkeley speak. He said this man really knew the story, and he didn't mince any words and wasn't hesitant to speak out what he really thought, that we should have him to speak. Well, we went from speaking to several people to having a mass rally out the Cotton Bowl where we could have 50, maybe 70,000 or more people in attendance. The idea behind this is that any time you get 50 to 70,000 people speaking up for anything, you're going to make a real impact on your city officials as well as your national people. So we felt that this would give people an outlet to express their concern. Most people are concerned about this, as we found, but they didn't know what to do. They had no outlet for their energies. So with the rally, we'll be able to have a strong show of public concern, which we think will give good support to public officials. Then we'll also be able to channel them to organizations that are actively working or set up to help people with a drug problem. Also be able to offer perhaps other solutions as far as community action. So what we're trying to encourage then is to each individual go out and get their neighbor and get themselves and be in attendance out the Cotton Bowl. We had visits with Mayor Johnson and City Manager McDonald and Chief Dyson of the Police Department. And we've scheduled this thing for May the 16th at the Cotton Bowl, and it'll be tentatively set for 1:30. We might change that if we have a public or a large name personality come in that needs to be in at 1 o'clock instead of 1:30 or something to meet plane schedules.
The city of Fort Worth has been ordered by the Texas Water Control Board to clean up the mess at the Riverside sewage plant. To motorists traveling on the Dallas-Fort Worth Turnpike, it's odorously clear that indeed something needs to be done about the situation. The Water Control Board has ordered the installation of a chlorination process, which according to their experts is needed to prevent the raw sewage from reaching the Trinity River. The order calls for the equipment to be operational by the summer, which according to the calendar is only a couple of months away. The city of Fort Worth has been stalling the installation until their own report is completed on the matter. According to certain sanitation officials, there is some evidence that the chlorine could be harmful to the soil in this area and that it could present somewhat of a hazard in the Trinity River water.
Do you feel the federal government should step in and assist the state in caring for the great natural resources of your state?
Well, that depends on what you mean. Sometimes the federal government overprotects us, you know, and I think that the state of Alaska certainly has the capability of handling its own conservation practices. However, because 97% of the land in Alaska is owned by the federal government, I think it would be unrealistic to say that they don't have some interest in the conservation of the resource in Alaska.
purchasing equipment to beef up the capacity of the Riverside plant to comply with the specifications of the Water Control Board. Art Sinclair reporting for Channel 8 News, Fort Worth.
The search for 4-year-old Renee Ogle has ended. The little girl has been missing since 5 p.m. yesterday when she wandered away while her parents were preparing a meal in the area. This is White Rock Creek, where the body of the little girl was brought to surface by 3 divers from the Dallas Fire Department about 10 a.m. this morning. I talked to one of the investigating officers, Lieutenant W.F. Southard, about the tragedy. Lieutenant Southard, can you describe this tragedy to me?
Yesterday afternoon, this little girl and her parents came to White Rock Creek area on a picnic, and the mother and father were in the process of preparing a meal, and they were busy, and they looked off, and the little child wandered off, and they made a missing report on her yesterday afternoon about 5 p.m. They made an intense search last night up into the wee hours of the morning. Then this morning at 8 a.m., we asked the National Guard for assistance. They give us 140 men immediately. Then they give us an additional 60 men. We had a total of 200 National Guard, and we made a complete ground search. We called in the Fire Department Rescue Unit. They had 3 divers. The divers recovered the little girl in about 10 foot of water. She was completely clothed and apparently just slipped into the water and drowned.
From the scene of the tragedy, this is Coach Eastcash for Channel 8 News.
I'm sure that geographical considerations have been used in making appointments, but there's not a clear pattern. There have been members on the court from the same state, for instance, at the same time. I think there's been a heavier concentration of appointments from eastern states, but that might be natural just in terms of the history of the country.
The history of the court is that geographical distribution has been taken into account in these appointments. I think it's wise also on the political side, since the Supreme Court is engaged in a gigantic job of reconciliation, to have geographic representation as well as philosophic or ideological.
Strict construction implies correct construction, and there isn't necessarily a correct construction of the Constitution, except what the Supreme Court might say it is.
I think a strict constructionalist, as that word is used now, would we mean a judge who was wary, cautious about extending the power of the judicial branch into areas that are not really judicial, or controversies that are not really judicial in nature.
Justice Black may be the strictest constructionist on the court. He takes a strict constructionist view of the First Amendment, that free speech means free speech, which means there cannot be any laws relating to libel. There cannot be any laws prohibiting distribution of pornographic literature, obscenities, and so forth. That's a strict constructionist view, if you might say.
The term that the lawyers use is activist, usually, as indicating those judges who seem to be ambitious to extend themselves into what might be called non-judicial areas. The court now, unfortunately, doesn't have anyone who is, or doesn't have any great number of judges who would restrain themselves. Judge Harlan is a good example. The new Chief Justice is moving in that direction.
I think it is true that this court has been an activist court with regard to civil rights, protection of minorities, and so on.
This is, of course, the devil.
Yes, you are right.
Is evil easy to draw?
Evil is very easy to draw, you know. He's smiling, he's always pointing something, yes.
What is the hardest vice to illustrate?
The hardest?
Yes, of those.
Oh, I don't know. All the vices are very amusing to draw, you know.
What is the hardest thing to illustrate?
The hardest thing, the virtues, I think, you know. That's very difficult. It is something inside. You cannot express so well what is inside. The serenity, for instance, you know, you are just peaceful with a smile, with the bright eyes maybe, but how to draw that with a piece of chalk on a blackboard? It is impossible. I think that a little sense of humor help always serious things, you know. And as often as I can, I am drawing in such a way that people can recognize themselves, you see.
Texas was the largest state in the United States, and it's built on much oil money. What lessons do you think that Alaska could be learning from perhaps mistakes Texas has made in its development?
Well, I don't know what mistakes, if any, Texas has made. I certainly want to be on a friendly basis while I'm here. I think, however, that the lessons that Texas has learned over the years certainly can benefit Alaska. We are interested in the Texas Railroad Commission, which I understand regulates the oil and gas policies of the state of Texas. And in Alaska, this is a little more confined in that the Commissioner of Natural Resources, the Commissioner of the Department of Natural Resources, has the basically the same duties as the Texas Railroad Commission. So we're, believe me, taking a real good look at Texas and Alberta and other oil-producing areas that have had some experience that we haven't had in Alaska.